How about that? Does it sound any better? Does it sound any better? No? Oh, man. Okay. All right. Hang on just 1 second more. Maureen, if you're listening, I'm going to leave the room for a moment if you'll admit me back in. I think I have to make you the host. All right, I am back, and Maureen, if you know what, let me try something here. I wonder if, I don't know if it makes any difference with me being the host or you being the host. How about I share my screen as not the host, and let's try that, see if it makes any difference. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen without being the host. We're going to experiment.
Good, okay.
Here. Okay, so let me share. Let's see, I need to get my PowerPoint back up first. All right, so there's that. And I'm going to share a screen. I'm going to share this screen. And I'm not going to share computer sound. Okay. There we go. All right, now where'd my chat go? Need chat. All right, almost ready to go. I just need to be where I can see chat. I'm not seeing that. All right, just a moment more, folks. Just making sure. I just want to be able to, I want to be sure that I can see when you guys have something to say. There's chat over here on the other side. Okay, Good, good, good. All right. Well, I hope that fixes it. Anyway, if it doesn't, just let me know and we'll take another little break again, and maybe that will fix it up. Sorry about that interruption. Anyway, let's see, where were we? Okay, so yeah. All right, so essentially England, thanks to these Carolina guys, is claiming all of Spanish Florida for Carolina. Okay, and this is the 1660s is when they first established Carolina, and the 1670 is when they established Charlestown. So 1670 is about where we are right now. Okay, so that same year, 1670, the Spanish and English, they signed a treaty called the Treaty of Madrid that essentially freezes all English incursions into the New World right where they were. Okay, and what the treaty says is essentially anything that English settlers currently and truly actually owned that they had possession to. So the Spanish couldn't like chase them out of any places that they had. Now the Spanish really gave some stuff up with that because they gave up Jamaica. The English had gotten hold of Jamaica by that time. They had gotten hold of the Grand Caymans, the Caymans, and of course, since they had established, wow. Really? So we're still having sound problems. I don't get it. It's fine on my end. You guys all look great. I don't know. All right. I'm going to continue and try to speak slowly, and hopefully this will be okay. Anyway, let's see. So in addition to that, because of this Treaty of Madrid in 1670, that meant that the let's see, let me get the pen here, that this Charleston also would be part of the part that England was allowed to keep. So the Spanish grudgingly were okay with Carolina extending as far south as Charleston. The Carolina settlers actually interpreted this treaty differently. What they said was, okay, Treaty of Madrid, you're saying that the English get to keep everything that they actually occupied up until 1670. Well, our charter says that we're supposed to be occupying everything down to the 29th, to the 29th parallel down there, essentially where Daytona Beach is, right down here. And so, anyway, so they actually use that as a license to continue attacking Spanish interests in what's now the southeastern United States. Now, the Spanish try to fight back against this. In 1686, they have a guy named Tomás de Leon who destroys Port Royal up here in modern-day South Carolina and sacked every plantation that he could find in Georgia and the Carolinas. That was essentially the only major incursion that the Spanish were able to effect. So let's see. Wow, are we still having problems? Oh, man. Okay, let me get to the end of this section. We might try something else here. All right, but to make a long story short, what ends up happening is Spain was never able, they could protest all they wanted to, but they were never able to really keep the English out of the area above roughly the St. Mary's River. So interestingly enough, that's how we end up with the St. Mary's River being the traditional northern boundary of Florida. Not because of anything the United States did, but rather, well, yes, later on down the line, but the way we first get the St. Mary's River as the northern boundary of Florida in the northeastern part of the state is because that is the line to which the Spanish were militarily able to actually hold as the English in Carolina started working their way south. Okay, so moving on to the next section. Meanwhile, in the West, we've talked a lot. So this map kind of shows you essentially what that looks like. Now, this is actually drawn to be a little bit south of the mouth of the St. Mary's, but this is essentially showing you the new normal after Charleston is established here, and after the Carolinians start making these incursions into what had been Spanish Florida. So that's kind of where the status quo falls for a while in the early 18th century, the 1700s, with the Spanish and the English. But now let's talk about what's happening farther west. So the French had been busy in North America as well. It's just that they had been busy farther north. After they claimed Canada, you remember we had some French explorers last week who were exploring Canada and the St. Lawrence River and all of that. They started establishing outposts on the Great Lakes, okay? And after they got all of that done, they started sending French explorers down the Mississippi River. Okay, so if I get over here on the map, you can see over here they've got Illinois, that's a French established area, and then they start going down the Mississippi River trying to find the mouth. Easier said than done, because there's still Native Americans in the area. The river is, of course, very swift. You know, weather they have to worry about. They have got, you know, have to land and get supplies from time to time. So it takes them a little while to get this done. 1682. Robert Cavalier, Sieur de la Salle, finally gets the mouth of the Mississippi River right here, and he discovers that it's not just one mouth, but actually several mouths. The clawfoot mouth, I think they called it at one time, or birdfoot mouth, something like that. And he claims the entire valley for France. Now, what does it mean when you claim an entire valley? Essentially, it means whatever you want it to mean and whatever your map maker is actually able to show, and most crucially, what you are actually able to hold militarily. So, as far as the French were concerned, Louisiana was essentially this. Everything, everywhere there wasn't a British person or a Spanish person over here, the French were calling that their territory, and they named it after King Louis at the time, Louisiana. Now, how far that actually stretched in reality is a different story, okay? But it's happening. Now, as this is happening, remember, as I've said before, nothing is a secret over in the grand courts of Europe. So the Spanish know that the French are over here doing stuff. They know that they're exploring, they know that they're claiming territory, and that they have this new thing that they're calling Louisiana. But nobody in Spain really knows exactly where that is, okay? So they start sending out some expeditions to go and try and make contact with the French. In fact, between 1685 and 1690, they send no fewer than 11 different expeditions to go and find the French somewhere over here in what they're calling Louisiana. While they're searching, they make a rediscovery. You may remember from last week that in the 1550s, the Spanish discovered Pensacola Bay, which they called Ochusi Bay at that time. And they liked it, and they attempted to make a settlement there. Well, the settlement didn't work out. Poor Tristan de Luna really wasn't that great of a leader, it looks like. And he had some bad luck with the weather as well. And essentially, Pensacola did not take off the first time. However, with this new French threat brewing in the West, the English decided that they would give Pensacola another go. And so in a nice, and they thought it was the ideal place to sort of build a Westernport there because it had a great harbor. They liked it even better than Mobile. These people knew where Mobile was. They could have gotten Mobile Bay if they wanted, but they liked Pensacola better. I happen to like Pensacola better too. Don't tell the people of Mobile. Okay? In a nice compliment to Pensacola, there was a pilot named Juan Jordan de Reina who called Pensacola the best bay I have ever seen in my life. I happen to like it a lot myself. Now, as always, with these expeditions, as we've seen with other explorers, it takes a while to get the bureaucratic stuff out of the way, to get ready for one of these expeditions. But they finally got one ready to sail in 1698, so it took almost a decade after they realized that the French are kind of hanging out over here in the West somewhere, almost a decade for them to get ready to do this expedition. Very strange. But they get ready to do this. And so in November of 1698, here's Pensacola right here. All right. In 1698, November, two parts of the expedition, one part sailing from Veracruz in Mexico and one part sailing from Havana. They arrive here in Pensacola Harbor and they establish an outpost there on behalf of the Spanish. Now, this was fortuitous. They arrived just in time to claim Pensacola because 2 months later, French ships show up in Pensacola Bay, captained, or rather led by Pierre Lemoyne d'Iberville, who was brother of the guy named Bienville, who actually discovered and settled a little outpost, a French outpost here at New Orleans, a little town some of you have no doubt heard of. You'll note that there are streets in New Orleans in the French Quarter named Iberville and Bienville. Those are named after those brothers who were involved in French exploration here on the Gulf Coast in the latter part of the 17th century, the 1600s. So the French show up thinking that they might get a little piece of Pensacola Bay, but the Spanish had made it there first. And so the Spanish essentially told Iberville, you can kick rocks and make tracks and get out of here. And at that point, Iberville kind of freaked the Spanish out a little bit because instead of sailing back west the way he came, he actually sailed east into waters that were generally supposed to be Spanish. And so they were very concerned that he might go and try to set up some kind of an outpost at the mouth of the St. Mark's River, or maybe something in St. Andrews Bay or something like that. But thankfully for the Spanish, after a while, Iberville, maybe he was just playing chicken, he turned around and he went back west to where he had been beforehand. He spent a little time discovering or rediscovering what LaSalle had originally discovered a few years before at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And then he established this little fort right here at what is now Ocean Springs, Mississippi. I'm not quite sure what this name is meant to be because the fort that Iberville established at what's now Ocean Springs was called Fort Maurepas. Maurepas being a French official who was kind of overseeing all of this exploration at on the Gulf Coast. So, let's see, where am I in my notes here? So we get Fort Maurepas established. And so this is actually the beginning of several French establishments on the Gulf Coast. Fort Maurepas is part of it, of course. New Orleans is, of course, part of it. There's little encampments put in here all along the way. Over here at Manchac, there's something here because it's a nice little passage between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain right here, this little indention that you see. And a couple other things you might have heard of. Anybody like to go over to the casinos in Biloxi? Well, if you like going to Biloxi, this is when Biloxi was originally established. I also established that as well as Mobile over here. The French got involved with that too. So the French essentially built up a really heavy presence in the last part of the 1600s right here on the Gulf Coast. Now, you might think that that would be really bad for Pensacola, but in reality, relations between the Spanish at Pensacola and the French over here in what's now coastal Alabama and coastal Mississippi and southern Louisiana, the relationship is actually quite good. There is no immediate attempt for the French to expand eastward into Pensacola and Spanish Florida yet. There's none yet. But as we have seen, there are always events in Europe that can cause this to change. And that's exactly what we're going to see happen next. Here we go. So a little anything in Europe with these royal families. The dynastic ties between these ruling families of Europe are so intertwined that if anything happens, it can foment a war, it can cause disagreements, it can result in massive trade bargains. There's all kinds of things that can happen. And it's not just the political lives of these royal families and their courts, it's also the personal lives that can cause these things to happen. And that's exactly what happens in 1700. King Charles II, which is this very ghostly, pale-looking dude over here, this is his portrait. It's from the 1680s. this portrait is. So he was about 20 years older than this when he died in 1700. But when he died, he really caused some problems, because down here, this is down here in Spain, the Spanish monarchy. Of course, they control some stuff over here in Italy and Sicily as well, that sort of thing. And so King Charles II was a Habsburg. That was his family house, was the Habsburgs. And he died without having any children. Now, if you've studied British history at all, or any European history, you know that one of the main jobs of a European monarch is to, as soon as possible, produce an heir and a spare. The reason for that is that you've got to ensure the continuity of your royal house's ability to maintain control over your empire or over your kingdom. Okay? And so when Charles II died without having an heir, that caused a big problem, because it wasn't immediately clear which one of his many relatives would have the strongest claim to the throne. No one had an obvious claim to the throne. Now, two different groups of people tried to claim Spain as their rightful inheritance from Charles II. The easy one, if you and I look at the map here, is the Habsburg monarchy over here in parts of modern-day Germany and Austria, which was ruled at that time by another Habsburg. They said, well, he's one of ours, he's even got our name, so we should get Spain. We should get to put one of our people on the throne of Spain. France, on the other hand, was not exactly thrilled about being caught between two different Habsburg monarchies. And so King Louis XIV, the Sun King, at that time, he said, well, I'm not real keen about that. I think that the throne should go to my grandson, who was not a Habsburg. He was from the House of Bourbon. And so we've got France and the Habsburg monarchy both trying to put a kid on the throne of trying to put a kid on the throne of Spain. Now, I just got a message saying that that low system resources are making it to where it doesn't want to do high quality audio. So I'm going to take a quick break again. Let's see, we've got enough time for me to take a quick break again. I'm going to close the program and come back in and see if that makes any difference. I'll be back with you in just a moment. Maureen, I'm going to make you host again while I do that. I'm going to do it just as fast as I can.
Okay. I think I am the host, but yeah, okay.
Oh, that's right. Okay, good. I'm going to leave and come back. I'll see you in a minute.
All right, I'll let you back in. Okay.
right. Sorry, folks. This is really bizarre. This computer does everything else just fine. I don't know what's going on. And I mean, we use this computer for lots of other Zoom. You know, we've done Zoom meetings with this, Microsoft Teams. They all work fine. I don't get it. Anyway, we'll push on. And I think I will get a different computer for next week, though, just because this is annoying. Okay. All right, and let's get the chat. All right, there we go. Okay. All right, thank you guys. Sorry again for the interruption. I hope we're doing okay on sound now. Can I get a text from somebody if you're hearing okay sound?
It sounds okay now, Josh. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to continue to try to speak slowly, so if it does start to distort, we'll still be able to hear it. And then I do think next week we'll use a different computer. I have no explanation for why this one is not doing well. It works for everything else. So anyway, when we last were talking, we had King Charles II dies, and there's a fight over who exactly is going to get the throne. Will it be France? Will it be the Habsburg's monarchy, you know, over here in Austria and Germany? No one knew. And it produced a war called the War of the Spanish Succession. If you've ever heard of that, that's what caused it. It was all because one guy didn't do the one job that he had. He's allowed to live in the lap of luxury, but he didn't do that one thing. He didn't get himself an heir. So that started off a whole war that involved all of Europe, and it even involved North America. So the war manifested itself in North America mainly as an intense fear of the Spanish and French becoming allies against the fledgling English colonies. Okay, so let's just catch up real quick on where everybody is at this time. This is the base of Spanish power here in North America at this time, with a Pensacola kicker, right? Because they established this. Now, over here to the west of Pensacola, we have the French. They've been pretty friendly so far, okay? And then up here, we've got the English. They have not been terribly friendly so far, all right? So the big fear that the English had was that the French and Spanish would become allied because of this whole succession crisis. And so what that caused was Governor James Moore, who was governor of the Carolina province up here, he decided that he would do a little preemptive strike. He wasn't going to wait to see what the upshot of the succession crisis would be. He actually went ahead and took some action on his own recognizance. And so in 1702, this governor of Carolina, James Moore, he attacked St. Augustine both by land and sea. So he sent some folks over land, and he also sent a fleet to attack St. Augustine by sea. Now, it ended up being something of a stalemate. The Spanish governor at that time, whose name was Joseph de Zúñiga y Cerda, got everybody into the Castillo de San Marcos, the fort at that time right here. And so James Moore was not able to actually get to the bulk of the people to take them prisoner. Also, because he was having to travel a lengthy distance from his base up here in Carolina, he was not able to bring very heavy guns. And so he was not able to penetrate the coquina walls of the Castillo de San Marcos. Now, the flip side to that is that the Spanish, on their part, they were not strong enough to repel the Carolinian forces that were attacking the fort. So it turns out to be a stalemate. In fact, you could argue that it was a defeat politically for James Moore, the governor of Carolina, because this whole expedition ended up costing like 4 times as much as he had told his legislature that it would cost. And so they end up spending like 8,000 pounds on this invasion that does burn down the town of St. Augustine. But as we've seen before, St. Augustine gets burnt a lot, and it doesn't make them leave. As long as they've got that fort, the Spanish are going to be able to stick around right here in St. Augustine. So Governor Moore ends up resigning the governorship of Carolina. Now, that doesn't make him docile. It just makes him even madder. So what he decides to do next is he actually comes and attacks our part of Florida. 1703, he launched an attack on the line of missions that extended west from St. Augustine over into the area that was called Appalachia. Now, the eastern boundary of Appalachia is the Osceola River, which is now the boundary between Madison and Jefferson counties. And Appalachia goes at least as far as the Apalachicola River. And so the area that Governor Moore attacked in 1703 is actually right where we're all sitting right now. This is the area that was under attack in 1703. Almost every single Spanish mission in the area was destroyed, except for the mission San Louie, where we are here in Tallahassee. And that's not because they were particularly powerful and they were able to overpower Governor Moore. That's not how it happened. It's just that Governor Moore never quite made it to San Louie. There were actually Spanish soldiers who went out from Fort San Louie and met Governor Moore, but they actually were defeated. So San Louie got spared just because Moore essentially ran out of resources and men and went home before he could get over quite this far. So, over here on the western side, on the Franco-Spanish frontier around Pensacola, the French did not give the Spanish any trouble during the course of the War of the Spanish Succession. So the French are over here at Biloxi and Mobile and Iberville and all this sort of thing. They didn't give Pensacola any trouble, but in fact, they actually tried to help the Spanish repel another attack fomented by James Moore by way of some friendly Creek Indians, friendly to the English, I mean. He actually sent them to go and attack Pensacola. And why did the Spanish burn Mission San Louie? Now, actually, they didn't burn Mission San Louie. Mission San Louie was one of the ones they did not burn. It was one of the few that they did not burn, actually. But it's all the ones to the east of San Louie that they would have burned. In response to a question over here on the thing. Okay, let's see, where was I? Okay, so yeah, the French are actually being pretty friendly to the Spanish at this point over at Pensacola. They're actually helping the Spanish at Pensacola repel attacks from the friendly Creek Indians that were being sent against Pensacola by the English in Carolina. But as we've seen many times before, European politics are a little bit like a snow globe. Every time you shake it, you get a different combination of alliances and agreements. And so just a few years later, after the War of the Spanish Succession kind of ended, a new conflict arose that did actually cause Spanish Florida to not only have enemies to its north over here on the Atlantic side, but also coming in from the west. And so what that is in 1719, there was a new war that broke out in Europe. And this is separate from the War of the Spanish Succession. It's totally separate. But in this particular war, Spain was opposed by a quadruple alliance. In fact, it's called the War of the Quadruple Alliance. They ran out of cute names, so they had to call it something simple. And England was in that quadruple alliance, Austria, Holland, and France. And they all opposed Spain. So because of that, the French settlements over here to the west of Pensacola decided that they would do their part by attacking Spanish holdings in the New World. And then ensued something I really think a movie should be made out of this, because it's almost comical to see how this happened. Okay, so let's see, okay. So there was another, I mentioned that Iberville, the French guy who tried to take Pensacola from the Spanish back when they first kind of got back into it in the late 1600s, that he was the younger brother of Bienville, the guy who settled New Orleans. Well, that family apparently had a lot of boys, because there's actually another brother, the younger Bienville, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville, who's also brother to the founder of New Orleans. And he's actually the one who leads the French march on Pensacola in 1719, when the War of the Quadruple Alliance breaks out. And so what ends up happening is Bienville takes Pensacola, 1719. But when the French captured Pensacola, one of the surrender terms that the Spanish were able to get out of the French was that the French agreed to actually transport the captured Spanish soldiers back to their kind of home base, their regional base down in Havana, okay? So the French get Pensacola in 1719, and they sail the captured Spanish soldiers, the garrison, back down to Havana. Now, everybody all over the Caribbean knows that the War of the Quadruple Alliance is going on. So what happens when the French guys get down here with these prisoners of war? The Spanish at Havana actually seize the French ships, and they take their Spanish guys off, and then they make the Frenchman prisoner. And then they send a Spanish garrison, a new Spanish garrison, up to Pensacola in the French ships, so that there's no suspicion. Those ships come back to Pensacola Harbor, and those Spanish guys in those French ships, they actually retake Pensacola a second time. But wait, there's more. The French figure this out pretty quick, and they end up doing almost the exact same thing again. They send a new fleet over to Pensacola, and they actually take it back from the Spanish now a second time that way as well. So Pensacola went from being Spanish to French to Spanish, and now back to French, all in the space of about 10 years. It's pretty funny. And this time around, France was a little smarter. They did not take any Spanish back to Havana, and they ended up holding Pensacola, and they did not give it back to the Spanish until 1722. Now that quieted things down in the West, just in time for one more big problem to happen in the East before the end of the day. I'm looking at the time, and we've got time for just one more little episode before we close this up. So we get things quieted down after the War of the Quadruple Alliance over here in Pensacola, but we got one more little problem that pops up in 1733. You've probably heard Ray Charles sing about this little problem. It's called Georgia. So we got Carolina up here. This is where Governor Moore and all his buddies are hanging out. But in 1733, our friend James Oglethorpe establishes a whole new English colony. He lands right here at Savannah, beautiful city, of course. And they establish a whole new British colony here at Georgia, in between the this disputed land between Spanish Florida down here on the south and Carolina on the north. And again, all these lines are very fluid at this time. The traditional southern boundary of British-held North America at this point. I'm sorry, why did French give Pensacola back to the Spanish in 1722? It was a term of the treaty at the end of the War of the Quadruple Alliance. Good question. Very good question. That was, once the war was over, there's a lot of territory swapping that happens at the end of each of these never-ending little wars. And in this case, that was one of the terms of the agreement, was that any land that France had captured from the Spanish in continental North America would go back to the Spanish. So, let's see where we. Okay, so Oglethorpe founds Georgia in 1733, and like Governor Moore before him in Carolina, he was also anxious to neutralize the Spanish threat to the south. To these English guys who were building up these massive plantations and these huge settlements in comparison with what's happening in Florida, they really saw Spanish Florida as just a flea. If they flicked it just right, they would be able to get the Spanish out of North America forever. And that's why they keep trying these attacks, because they cannot believe that St. Augustine keeps holding on through all of this. They can't even figure out why the Spanish won it. They're clearly not making any huge plantations or anything. If it weren't for that strategic location of St. Augustine on the Spanish Main, they probably wouldn't have been holding it. But suffice it to say, Oglethorpe decides he wants to take a crack at getting St. Augustine. And so he needs a pretext. You know, you can't just declare war out of nowhere, because it becomes a lot easier for your opponent to drag in reinforcements to go after you. It also makes it a lot easier, for your activities to not be sanctioned by your sovereign and not get assistance from the state military. So, yet another of those innumerable European wars breaks out very conveniently for Oglethorpe in 1739, and it's very peculiar. It's called the War of Jenkins Ear. The War of Jenkins Ear. And the war gets its name from something that actually happened 8 whole years before the war actually breaks out into a shooting war. What had happened is an English smuggler by the name of Robert Jenkins had been sailing in Spanish waters in the Caribbean, and he was stopped by a Spanish officer. His ship was boarded. They determined that he was a smuggler, and the Spanish officer allegedly cut off Jenkins' ear and handed it to him. That's the story. Now, there's all kinds of stories about the ear being paraded before Parliament over in England and all this sort of thing. There's no evidence to suggest that Jenkins' ear actually made it back across the Atlantic. However, that episode was used in 1739, a few years later, to foment a war between England and Spain. And that's what Oglethorpe used as his pretext to march southward and make his attempt to take St. Augustine. The results were not that different from the way that Governor Moore had experienced Florida. Oglethorpe had no problems getting to St. Augustine, but just like Moore, he was never able to actually take the fort. And so the end game of all that is that Georgia, much like Carolina, was forced to stay above the St. Mary's River, further reinforcing that river as the boundary line between Spanish Florida and English possessions that would, in just a few years, become American possessions. That's going to become important here in just a bit. All right, the last thing that happens that we need to kind of close out and tell you about. So, all of this is happening, and I mentioned that, it just seemed like it should have been so easy to get Spain out of North America, to get Spain out of Florida, but it just never seems to happen. It does finally happen in 1763. But ironically, the blow that is struck against Spain that finally knocks it out of Florida for good, with an asterisk, is actually not the shot of a cannon or of a musket. It's the stroke of a pen. So the French and English colonies in North America got involved in something called the French and Indian War, which was actually kind of part of a bigger war that was also going on in Europe called the 7 Years' War. Long story, take my word for it. But in North America, it's primarily between French and English colonies. The upshot of that war, which was codified in the Treaty of Paris. We're going to see a lot of treaties of Paris next week, but this is the first one that matters, the Treaty of Paris. Spain ceded to Britain, to Great Britain, all of its claims in Florida. And the reason it did that was because during the course of the 7 Years' War, the British had actually captured Havana. And remember how I said that Havana was kind of the nerve center of the Spanish Caribbean? Well, as you've seen, Havana is a lot more important to Spanish interests in the Caribbean than Florida was. Florida at that time was essentially just a glorified lookout post along the Spanish Main. Havana, that was an administrative capital. So in the negotiations, Spain decided that Florida was expendable, Havana was not. And so they traded Florida to the British to get Havana back. In addition to that, the French also lost out in this, and they were forced to give up their territory along the Gulf Coast to the British as well. And all of that ends up being given to the British in a province that they decided to call West Florida. And so because of that, you end up, and I'm going to take all my marker stuff away here so that you can see it all. You end up with this map right here at the end of the French and Indian War, and this is where we're going to leave it for today. In 1763, you get two Floridas. You got Spanish Florida, East Florida over here, and then you got West Florida, which carries it all the way over to the Mississippi River and Baton Rouge. And that's why I always like to say that this was the era when Florida touched the Mississippi. And that's going to do it for us for today. Next week, we're going to see that the British hold on Florida is actually quite short. The Spanish will get it back, but how long will they get it back for? So just have to tune in next week and find out. Are there any questions?